Yeah, I think we're live. Welcome everybody to this webinar and Q&A with David Edwards, and he'll introduce himself in a short while. I think we have guests and viewers from Uganda, the Netherlands, Mexico, and I think also from the United States, and probably a little bit beyond as well. And most of you are in pilot we are conducting at the moment, and we're going to go into that a little bit as well later on. It's all about David this 30 minutes. Well, David, let's just to start. I know who you are. Lots of other people, I think, who are in a global, have a global perspective on education, know who you are. But I think a lot of people outside of EI or union movements might not know who you are. So let's start with you. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what your background is, from teaching experience, and why are we here and why you're here? What's your mission?
Why am I here?
Big question.
I think maybe most people don't know me, but they know a lot of people that I'm associated with and try to support and work with out and around. So yeah, I'm David Edwards. I'm the Deputy General Secretary of Education International, responsible for our areas of research, education policy, employment, advocacy, and communications now.
Mm-hmm.
It's not been a straight road. Let's just say that I didn't wake up one day in college and said I wanted to be a global teacher union leader. But I think what has happened over the course of my life is that I have asked certain questions at certain moments, and when I look for the answer to those questions and I look at where the search for those answers have taken me, it has sort of developed into a path that has led me here. So I am from Pennsylvania in the United States. Mm-hmm. Originally, just Amish country outside of Pittsburgh. And what I did was, right at the end of high school, I was an exchange student. There's a nice plug for exchange, but I was an exchange student to Austria. And while I was in Austria, I realized that as an American, we're somewhat protected in terms of what we're aware of, sort of our own political activism, in terms of our own independence. And there I was in a language school, a Sprachgymnasium, and I was able to, leave and come as I wanted to. I had very collegial relationships with the professors. Mm-hmm. We went for coffee, and so I knew there was something that was going on that was a bit different than sort of the standardized, routinized command and control that I was living.
Was it different from your American experience?
Yeah, it was very. I mean, we actually had a vice principal that stood in the parking lot and would make sure during lunch break that no one ever went outside to try to go to eat. And in Austria, we would actually go with our professors to get coffee and things like that during breaks. So it was quite different that way. It was different in terms of, I think, the litigious way in the U.S. Everything looked like a potential lawsuit. Mm-hmm. And so you want to make sure that kids are protected and controlled. And I think that's changing somewhat. And I think that as over the last 25 plus years since I graduated from high school, things have changed. But I was in Austria, and I learned Austrian dialect, German. Fell in love, as many people do in international situations. Ended up going to the University of Vienna. Was studying political science there, and it was during the time of the Bosnian War. Mm-hmm. And there was a number of refugees that were coming into Vienna at that time, and I was trying to work a diplomatic, line to become some kind of UN bureaucrat of sorts. And a friend needed to go do something, and she was interning at a welcome center for Bosnian refugee children, which was helping them integrate into the Viennese school system, and asked me if I would like to come in and take over her class for a day. And that was a very important moment, because that was the best day, one of the best days of my life, when I was with these students. Many of them were orphaned. Many of them were really scared and talking about their experiences. And I never went back to my old internship. I stayed there. I asked if I could continue. I changed my major to education. I went on and actually became a German teacher,
Mm-hmm.
taught in Ohio. And then I actually did something crazy. I went to Bolivia, and I ran a center for street kids in Bolivia. And then from there, I got picked up to work in an orphanage, helping the teachers in the orphanage. I worked with a Bolivian nonprofit that was supporting teachers in Bolivia. So it was also an education. But as I was in Bolivia, this was at the time of the Banzer dictatorship. And Banzer, who was a terrible man, had turned over child welfare to his wife as a charity. So all orphanages in Bolivia were basically run by his wife and her, pearl necklace, ladies group.
Mm-hmm.
And they had this great idea that they wanted to privatize and decentralize the orphanage system in Bolivia. And they brought in some, let's just say, fundamentalist groups who basically cut the rations, used the time in terms of the food, basically really did a lot of damage. And at that point, I was going, how is it possible that decentralization and this sort of privatization and the state absconding from its responsibility can happen so easily?
Mm-hmm.
And people that were with me at the time, that was at the time of Evo Morales' rise in Bolivia, and I was involved with a lot of the popular movements there, said, it'd be really good to go learn the language of power and try to study this stuff. And so I figured the best place to go do that would be the center of power in terms of all that, which is Harvard. And so I went there and I studied international ed policy, and I learned about, everything from conflict theory to what, just more of the neoliberal sort of technicist approaches to education. From there, I was about to go back to Bolivia, but I got hired from the Organization of American States to be a education specialist on teachers' issues.
Mm-hmm.
So went to Washington, and that job there was to work with ministries of education. So.
And was it also where you were involved with ITEM?
That's where I founded ITEM.
Founded ITEM, yeah.
Yeah. So I was noticing that teacher educators seemed to be the group that had the least amount of opportunities for dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
but seemed that they were an important group to be talking to. And so with some colleagues there, we built a network that's then gone far beyond what I've done, and it's become a very large teacher network and teacher educator network in Latin America. And I was there for a while working with ministries. I'm helping there on that side. And one day I was in Mexico City organizing an education ministerial meeting, and I was sitting at a table. I told this in my interview for NEA, which is where I worked after that. And the man at the table, who was the Secretary of Education under W. Bush,
Mm-hmm.
told me that he had a plan. We told this whole table for trying to do to public education in the United States what he had done in Houston, Texas, which was basically to privatize the services. And he would have pulled it off too if it wasn't for the NEA that stopped him. And I made a note on my napkin and put it in my pocket to look them up. And I saw that they had an opening in international relations, and I applied. And within a matter of weeks, I was at the International Relations Department of the NEA. So working on the other side of the fence.
Some things are meant to be, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it feels that way. Yeah. And did that for several years. Had a great opportunity working with NEA, and was working more and more with Education International. Was one of the representatives of NEA in a lot of different work, and the opportunity arose to come here. So about 5 years ago, I applied for the Deputy General Secretary position here and was accepted, and the rest has been history.
Yeah.
That's probably a lot longer answer than you were looking for.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, I think it's important that people, get to know. It's not just about policy; it's also about personality and drive, I think, and vision and mission. So what I want to do is sort of like take a really broad perspective first, and then move towards education, and then so where are we heading in a teaching profession? And we had this conversation. We have this conversation every time we see each other, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But still, and we both noticed that we were sort of at a crossroads, and you've been talking about this a lot
Yeah.
lately. And you handed out a book called On Tyranny, 20 lessons, 20 lessons from the 20th century, from Timothy Snyder.
Yeah.
Wonderful book. I use it in my classroom as well. So where are we at the moment, and where are we going? And so can you put this in where you are, this in a global perspective?
Sure. This will only take about 6 hours, so
Yeah.
so buckle up. No, I mean, anyone that paid attention to what happened, whether that was first with Brexit or then with the Trump election, a lot of people were asking the question, how could this happen? How is it possible that an educated populace could be duped into believing in alternative facts? How could they be duped into believing a authoritarian populist narrative that was being sold to them by a billionaire who right now is about to pass a big tax bill where he's going to take money from the poor and give it to the rich, and tell the poor that that's not actually happening, although we can quite easily see that. And one of the things that I tried to read a lot of books after the election. This has been a tough year for everybody worldwide, trying to make sense. And it's not just an assault on reason. It's also an assault on democracy. And it's also an assault on the type of pluralistic, informed, inclusive democracy that I believe in, and that I believe most in the teachers' union movement and most teachers believe in terms of being able to engage in a dialectic, a dialogue using facts and evidence to interpret those in light of what's happening, and to try to extend thinking and to try to help young people understand what's going on, what the science says, what the evidence says, whether that's climate change, whether that's, coal companies trying to tell them that climate change isn't real. And there was a feeling like we've been here before. Even though I'm not quite old enough to remember the Second World War or many of the other wars. What Timothy Snyder does is he basically says, yes, we have been here before, and there are warning signs when democracy is at risk. And those really resonated with me. But they were simple things. I mean, one of the things that really was talking, one of the chapters, one of the lessons is strengthen institutions. Yeah. And I think a lot of people take institutions for granted. We take a free press for granted. We take our public education system for granted. We take our public services, our health. We take a lot of these things as just, they've always been there. They will always be there. And there was on tyranny, there's a section, I believe it was from a Berlin newspaper, if I'm not wrong, maybe it was a Munich newspaper, but it was coming from sort of a Jewish group who was talking about the fact that, we all just need to calm down, all these things talking about putting Jews into ghettos and, camps and things. That's just extremist talk. That's not going to happen. Europe would never let that happen. We have the UN, we have systems, we have protections. This could never happen. And you read that and you get chills, because you turn on the television and you see whatever Twitter fight Trump is in, or whatever thing that Boris Johnson has said, or Erdogan saying that evolution will no longer be taught in schools. And so there is an assault on knowledge, and there is an assault on the people who are trying to ensure that knowledge gets constructed in meaningful ways with their students and interpreted. And there is an assault on something else, which is beyond knowledge, which is wisdom. And to me, a lot of people talk about teachers as knowledge workers, but I think a more apt description for what we are and what we need to be, particularly right now, is wisdom workers. And wisdom workers bring our values, they bring our histories, they bring the multiple perspectives, because they're able to listen to different groups, to women, to ethnic minorities, to other groups, to make sure in an inclusive way that those perspectives are included. And that, when we see the warning signs of autocratic regimes or corporate takeovers of our schools that are trying to monetize and privatize and really see, the $6 trillion potential industry that public education represents, to really organize around that and to talk about that and to teach that and to fight back at a time when we're also being told, the only things that matter is what can be tested. The only subject areas that are important are those that can be tested by psychometricians on standardized tests. And that basically we are being told this isn't wisdom work, it's not knowledge work, it is content delivery.
So is there, you have this global perspective, bigger trends are going on, which we all see around us, and not just in the West, but you also talked about Turkey, but I think it's a global
it's global
issue, and it's been longer running probably than lots of people are figuring out. So we're figuring out what a lot of people have been experiencing for a long time.
Sure.
It's now also rising in the West. So how does this translate? You already mentioned it a little bit. How does this translate into education? So there's this classroom perspective where you as a teacher protect your professional space, and you wanna bring that holistic vision into the classroom and be a role model for your students, I guess. And how does that work on a policy level? So how do you see those? You mentioned privatization, for example, deprofessionalization. Is that linked to something like Trump and Brexit? How is that? What's the connection between it?
Sure. Well, I mean, a word that you hear a lot is porosity. So those of you who have the pleasure and displeasure of hearing a lot of policy wonks talk, it's about how classrooms need to be opened up to the markets, and the profession needs to be opened up, that we're a monopoly of sorts, and that we need to be open. But porosity as a concept, I think, is in that construct is looking in a very instrumentalist way at education in schools. And so the policies that get developed, a porosity from the teacher's perspective is not so much just opening up holes to communities, but building connections to communities. It's about bringing voices in. It's about bringing texts. It's about saying this is what we're trying to achieve. This is what we want to have. This is the problem we want to look at. This is how we're going to collaborate. This is how we're going to work on those things. But that doesn't fit very easily into the policies of a Trump. I don't even want to give him the credit of saying that he's actually thought through a policy, or DeVos, or any of them. I don't believe there's
people around them.
People around them, I think, try to use that. Well, they want to pay less taxes. They don't want to have to deal with those meddling teachers unions that organize protests when we want to take health care away from poor children and things like that. So they try to pass policies that are based on competition. So part of the frame, Pasi Sahlberg calls it the global education reform movement. One of it has to do with competition and sort of market-based forces. This idea that we're best when we're set off against each other and not collaborating and working together towards a collective end. When we're standardized, the work we did on We the Educators, you can put a plug in there for that's on our website. You can look at some of that.
What was that?
We the Educators. Well, this was a collaboration between EI, the Canadian Teachers Federation, and the Alberta Teachers Association, where we were saying, a lot of this stuff that's happening in the global, in what we call the GERM, Global Education Reform Movement, is really hard to digest and make sense of. And so we thought that what we would do is take these sort of complex sort of literature reviews around datafication, standardization, personalization, privatization, these things, and try to put them into a more public sphere to have a conversation about what they are and what the evidence says and what they mean. So we did a series of videos. We launched them at our Rotterdam conference a couple months ago, and it is really to just try to get it out there in the ether, out there in the conversation. So, I said datafication. Datafication sounds really, it's one of those vacation words. I don't even know how it translates into Dutch.
I don't know. Datificatie. No,
Datification. It's the Portuguese.
Something like that, yeah.
But basically what it is a lot like just looking at our students as, profit points, looking at our teachers as potential profit points themselves, and taking all of the good collaboration, online work, the stuff that you're doing and all your system flippers and everybody else out there are doing, and trying to find a way to sort of commoditize that, or if not commoditize it, try to extrapolate from that the data, which are the preferences, the behaviors, your think about it in terms of like Amazon, So you go onto Amazon, you look at a few things, there's an algorithm that says, okay, you're a guy that likes to travel and you like the color pink and you might be from this country, so things in this language. And then they try to tailor to you a bunch of things for you to buy.
So it's like what they would call surveillance capitalism. So like your complete transparency of who you are in data points, and that's who you are.
Absolutely, yeah. and privacy is out the window, and it's been very troubling to us because we've been able to sort of pull back in many different ways and looking through trade deals. We've been analyzing different trade deals and seeing who are the big companies that have an interest in pursuing a datafication, looking at the big testing companies, who are the ones that are winning the contracts for the big global learning metrics, looking at the textbooks companies, who are the ones that are going to benefit from basically being able to produce the texts and the tests and the teacher preparation programs and evaluating the whole thing and going to ministries and selling their wares. And we find that many of them are linked up with big data companies that are slicing and dicing in ways that they're not necessarily talking about.
So there's an ulterior motive.
There's an ulterior motive, and that is to be able to take the preferences of a student or take even the life chances of a student or a community and be able to sell them to a corporation or a company and say, if you want to target here, looks like this community is going to probably be able to graduate at this level and have this type of income, and they can actually go all the way down into sort of what kinds of communities, what kinds of markets. So they're building markets, right? And and they're building markets in terms of what they're able to do in terms of trade deals. So you have big companies that used to be publishing houses like an Elsevier or a Pearson, and now they're lobbying to try to open up education, both in terms of higher education, but in terms of K-12. There's smaller groups. They changed their name. There's now consulting firms that are actually out there trying to help companies figure out where public education can be opened up and privatized most readily. US being a pretty good place right now, but
and that's the $4 trillion market we're talking about.
And so there's a whole sort of niche market, cottage industry opening up around that opening up. Basically, in the face of all of that, there's really teachers and their organizations and students and their organizations and families and communities who need to be woken up to what's happening, being given the evidence of it, and so that they can also be given the tools and the actions to show how they can defend their public institutions, like Snyder was talking about.
So let's take it there then. So what's EI doing? What are unions doing? And maybe also, because I also see a lot of good things happening around the world, so maybe we can also focus a little bit on more promising kind of
wrist slicing.
Or else everybody will switch off and never come back again.
I'm so depressed.
That's it. And I see some questions coming, so we'll answer those a little bit later. We'll just continue where we are, and we have some time reserved also for questions. And it's nice that the questions are being asked. So what's EI doing at the moment? So what are sort of some spearhead policies you're focusing on? What are some policies that promising union policies in a national context, and maybe some countries are doing good things?
So at the EI level, so EI we are our member organizations, our 400 member organizations. So part of what we try to do is pull up and roll up and share the good things that member organizations are doing. But in the face of deprofessionalization, in the face of a lot of these sort of, 3-day teacher prep programs or unqualified teacher rollouts where you have iPads being given to what they call teacher robots in some countries.
You're talking about Bridge?
Talking about Bridge,
yeah.
But it's not just Bridge. As a profession, we need to reclaim our profession. We need to assert ourselves. We need to no longer be describing the color of the water we're drowning in and really starting to learn how to swim.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we need to get our heads around is understanding that the sort of bread and butter issues that we have been fighting for, the human rights issues, the labor issues, the equality issues, and the professional issues need to be braided. They're threads that need to be braided together into a stronger whole that can hold the weight of what we need to do.
So those things can't be separated. You see the bread and butter issues and the professional issues.
Absolutely.
They're part of like what a union should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, and we've been doing some work on that front. We've been doing some work with Howard Stevenson. There's a shameless plug there for Howard's work on union renewal. We had a webinar with him not too long ago, where he did a series of case studies looking at good experiences where unions have been able to turn the corner on this and get out ahead in terms of what's meaningful, what do their members need, how do we help them make sense of this, but give them the tools and also connect them. It's no longer about holding information back and just giving little droplets of information. It's about really trying to connect people up, connect movements up, connect communities up, and build alliances to do that.
But that sounds like to me at least, from where I'm standing, like a no-brainer. That's not the case at the moment.
No, I mean, we're getting there. We call it the union renewal project, where we have the sort of a self-evaluation tool that a number of unions have been going through. They've been doing it themselves, because there's been a lot of attacks on unions. And I think in the past, and this is by no means all unions, but there is sort of a bunker mentality sometimes. And this can be in any aspect of your life. People are attacking you, and you don't want to get out. You want to hunker down and make sure you've got your basics covered. You're defensive, you're reactionary, right? They're going to do this, and then we'll see what we do and how we react. But to your members, the members want to see you out there. What's the vision we're fighting for? What is a high quality public education look like? What does a safe and secure school look like?
Like projecting positive image.
We're going to project that positive image. So it's there are a lot of great leaders that are doing important work on that, but it's not you can't take it for granted that everyone who thinks that about students' learning conditions automatically think about teachers' teaching conditions. That link that seems pretty basic and pretty clear. And there's a lot of research at the OECD level, at the Global Partnership for Education level, where they're sort of coming on to understanding that they actually really need to be developing a cadre of professional, collaborative, autonomous in many ways, people who could make decisions. You have to make, thousands of decisions in a split second, in
a classroom.
In a classroom, you can't really do that with an iPad and saying, now erase the board and walk around the classroom and now tell everybody what 1 + 1 is. It's a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's a big one. I would say another thing that we're doing is we're looking across all of the sort of professional standards and guidelines that unions have developed and saying, this is who we are as a profession. This is what we fight for. And those of you who are trying to water that down and lower that bar, stop it. We know who we are pedagogically. We know who we are in terms of our evidence and our research, and we know who we are in terms of our content and our expertise. And we're going to try to work EI with our affiliates to try to hold that. We're working with UNESCO and some others to try to keep that bar at a place where the teaching profession remains a real profession that we have control over.
Yeah. It's interesting because and this is also for the Dutch viewers and the Dutch teachers that are online. We have a big argument right now whether we should split professionalism and industrial issues. What's the role of the union? And I agree that they are inseparable. But there is a big discussion going on at the moment in what direction to take. And it's interesting to have I think for many people to have a more global perspective of what's going on and how is it going on in different countries. And well, you've just been to Latin America, and I always have a sense of a different vibe when I talk to Latin American teachers
Sure.
and unionists. So what are you taking? What's happening from there? So what's your key takeaway from?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd asked me 6 years ago, maybe I was super excited about what was happening. Now I'm excited, and there's pockets. For every action, there's a reaction, right? I was just speaking to the pedagogical movement of Latin America, which is what our Latin American region of EI organizes with their regional committee. It was in Belo Horizonte. We had about 1,000 educators from across Latin America there, and it was, they're unapologetically Freirean.
Yeah.
They're unapologetically saying.
So we're talking about Paulo Freire.
We're talking about Paulo Freire, and he's going to turn. It's 100 years, I think, next year from his birth, and so we're doing a lot of work on that, and they do workshops, they do all sorts of trainings, whether that's about how do you bring up issues and teach about inequality, how do you map power. How do you take on the sort of what Freire would call the banking model, which is that you just pour stuff into kids and then you evaluate it on the other side. How does the teacher understand themselves in a relational way with students in terms of the fact that you don't have to know everything at all times. Anybody who knows what I'm talking about. The fact that you can inquire and search and look, and that doesn't, it's democracy. Actually asking questions and trying to address problems and seeing how people feel about them and then negotiating through those. So with a lot of good work there. We had the Minister of Education of Bolivia. You can tell I've got my heart beats for Bolivia. My wife's Argentine, so I also beats for Argentina. But in Bolivia, you had sort of a 70% indigenous population who for a very long time, for decades, was pretty much controlled by a white ruling class, and the language of instruction was Spanish. The resources were very much apportioned to benefit the richest. And a person named Evo Morales, who was a popular rights leader, indigenous leader, basically said, wait a second, if we have 70% of the vote, why are we keep getting the same guys in the presidency and in the Ministry of Education? And why are we learning more about Spanish history than Bolivian history? Why are we second-class citizens? And they started rebuilding the education system in Bolivia. And now that's not popular because what they did was they increased taxes. They charged more for the price of gas, natural gas that they were selling. So now it wasn't one gas company that was able to extract everything and give them a couple pennies. They actually had to pay for what it was worth. And, I was talking to the Minister of Education, and he's going to host a big UNESCO conference coming up in July of next year. And he was saying, people don't like to talk about the success here because they're uncomfortable with how we did it. And they're uncomfortable with the fact where we said, if you're going to be a teacher teaching Aymara students or Quechua students, you need to also be trained in Aymara and Quechua. It's no longer fine just.
So bilingual, you need to be, or multilingual.
Yeah, and they developed a concept of interculturalidad, plurinational state of Bolivia, where they have teacher training centers, teacher education centers, where you can learn indigenous languages and you can use those. Now, the flip of that is indigenous families also want their kids to learn Spanish because that's how you access, a lot of opportunities. But, I'm very heartened because, when I first went to Bolivia, indigenous women were very much taking white kids to school with their own kids strapped to their back. And it would be dropping off these other kids at school, and you wouldn't see them in airplanes when I'd be flying in. I wouldn't see them. And now I just flew in recently, and because the flights are now much more accessible, you see them, indigenous women on the airplanes. They're going back and forth. They're teachers. They're doing all sorts of really interesting courses, and they have their own indigenous identities that they don't feel they have to sacrifice. And what the other thing that the minister did was he basically, with the unions, with the with indigenous groups, with the students groups, he created these different congresses that would meet with the ministry and sort of debate a lot of these issues. And so there's a lot more deliberative, direct democracy going on.
So networks, building alliances, people have a real voice in there in those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the people, I'm pretty sure the people who had more voice are quite frustrated right now, because when you have to make space for others, when you had a privilege, it's not going to be, you know, la-ti-da, just sort of, oh yeah, let me get it out of the way while you come. So there are tensions there, but I am heartened by what I'm seeing there, and you know, I think around Latin America, you know, you had the students movement in Chile.
Yep.
You know, with the teachers. You know, you had high school kids going into debt, taking out huge loans to be able to go to school.
To secondary education.
Secondary education.
Yeah.
And they said, no, it's got to be free. And free means free. And that's also in SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 4. You know, and free sometimes gets interpreted as affordable. And we have to kind of remind people that free means free. But
and that's sort of like the global discourse also that's going on at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a conversation going on right now where, you know, donors to educate. I'm going to the Global Partnership for Education board meeting next week, which will be hosted by President Macron in Paris.
And what is the Global Partnership?
The Global Partnership for Education is about a $4 billion fund that was set up. First, the Fast Track Initiative to say that no country with a good plan should not be able to have good quality education system for a lack of money. And at that time, a lot of donors countries came together and pooled their funds to make sure that money was available. But it was basically run by the bank, by the World Bank. And still to some extent, they have a disproportionate influence there. But what's happened is the GPE, they call it now the Global Partnership for Education, it has different constituencies. So you have civil society, you have teachers unions, you have developing countries, ministries of education, and you have donors around the table. It's more or less a consensus base. You know, they're trying to wrestle with this issue that countries have a target of 0.7% of GDP should go to education globally, and none of them are making it. And the thing is, do we take that as a given and say, okay, well, obviously there just isn't enough money? And we say no, because you also have domestic resource mobilization. We also have tax havens. There's also a lot of money that are in the countries that corporations and others are allowing to slip out. About 13 trillion by the last count, I think. You know, look at the Paradise Papers or all these kinds of things. But they're saying, you know, maybe the best thing we can do, and this isn't the GP, but members are saying that maybe even though rich OECD countries have free public education from early childhood, like you go all the way up to higher education in some countries, that's really too expensive for poor countries. So there is sort of a lowering the bar of expectations.
Just primary education.
Just primary education and maybe some online learning, and maybe we'll project a teacher into their classroom for a couple hours a week, or maybe they'll just be with an iPad. And you know, maybe if the parents can collect enough money, the one that's killing me the most is this sort of pay-as-you-go school chains that are being sold as in the West as this sort of really charitable, wonderful thing. You know, oh, we're getting good quality private education, you know, into these countries, and you're looking at it, and it's basically chicken coops. It's basically these substandard places where you would never want your kid to go, with unqualified teachers who have an iPad, who aren't being paid even a living wage.
And no capacity building whatsoever. So it's even draining money out of the public.
No capacity building whatsoever. And then we have these countries like Liberia where they're outsourcing their public education responsibility to private operators like that. And so there's a big debate raging right now. Is that acceptable? Is that desirable? And obviously EI has a view on that.
So yeah, so we already went into sort of lobbying, and you're there with the GPE, and there was union learning, and connecting all the teachers worldwide. So if you as I'm looking out from the classroom, and I'm still there one day, so why should I know about all this kind of stuff? So why, as a teacher, I'm teaching history every day. So should I be aware of these kind of things as a teacher? So what's my role here, and what's my role in connection to this global conversation and to these global discourses that are going on? My global representation that I think a lot of teachers don't know about.
Yeah.
So how does that? Where does that leave me as a classroom teacher, at least from my point of view in the Netherlands? So how does it connect up?
Well, the good news is if you are a member, if you pay your dues to a union, if you're a part of a union, a minuscule amount of that money helps us do what we're doing. Mm-hmm. So let me I'll take your question into different parts. So first, why should you care?
Yeah.
I think, like, if you are in your classroom right now and you're looking at reduced resources, reduced well-being, increased stress, more competitive models, less collaboration and planning time, less choices in terms of you choosing the content materials you use and more being dictated and told, less you developing authentic assessments that help you understand where your students are, and more you're being told these are standardized tests that you must deliver, and you realize, wait a second, now we're up to 10 hours a year, 20 hours a year.
Sounds like practice in the Netherlands.
So yeah. This is not just the Netherlands, this is worldwide. This is happening in many countries all around the world. There are policymakers that are getting together at the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, trying to ask the OECD and other experts, what can we do to have our children hit a cut score? And they may say, you need to increase your math instruction, or you need to, whatever the advice is. By being part of this, EI can actually be in those spaces. Mm-hmm. They know what the research is and what the research isn't. They know how it's being packaged and sold back to your governments. They know then how to make the counter argument for you. We can say what's coming and how do we push back on it. So that's, I think, a pretty big, from a policy angle, pretty important.
So it's like a counter lobby movement on a global scale.
Yeah, we're sort of like we can be an early warning system, we can be a rapid response system, but we can also be, because where we're different than a lot of these guys is we have a governance structure that also many of our members of our members don't know, is that we're democratically organized. Mm-hmm. We're committees, we have elections, we have leaders, we have systems, hopefully, for consultation, and that's happening at the national level. Why should you care that all the world's presidents and leaders met 2 years ago in New York City to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, where, thanks to EI and others, but a lot of EI, we actually have a standalone goal for education.
So it wasn't there?
It wasn't going to be there. Mm-hmm. They wanted it to be about learning. Ah. They wanted a goal or a target on 7-year-olds' words per minute. So that the entire global ambition that we have for learning and education on the planet would be a guy with a stopwatch and a 7-year-old with a book, basically. So we fought that, and we didn't just fight that. We what we were doing is we were organizing around the women's rights aspects there, around the decent work aspect. We were taking on all sorts of different things, and we were mobilizing members at national level to contact their governments to make sure that when it came time to negotiate these different goals and targets and indicators, the indicators, this is boring now, right? But indicators are how you measure against the targets. And each year, every couple of years, the governments have to come and report back on that. Mm-hmm. So if for teaching, we have highly trained, well qualified. We have being paid a salary that's commensurate with their training, so and their peers.
Mm-hmm.
So we're tracking how countries are doing in terms of their pay of their teachers, their support for their teachers, how often they get professional development. So we can actually hold governments accountable to that standard. I think that's also really important, and I think it's important that teachers know that they're not alone. I think it's important to know you're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
You're part of a global profession. You're part of a global movement. You're part of a global governance structure that gives you voice, and we need to do a better job at making sure that voice is carried to where it needs to be carried, and amplified. But I think all of those reasons are really important for people to understand. But we also do work in terms of, in many countries, teachers that try to form unions are disappeared. We had in the country of Bahrain, we had during the Arab Spring, a teacher union leader who had the audacity to hold up a sign to let his students out of the classroom to join the protest.
Mm-hmm.
He was kidnapped in the night out of his home and disappeared. And we worked with Amnesty International to get him released. He's one of 64 people, teacher leaders around this world, who don't have core labor standards and core human rights standards, and we have your back.
Yeah, and you can make a choice not to care or to care.
Yeah, and you can make a choice not to care, but
agree.
There's a Bonhoeffer quote on that one.
Yeah, hey, and sort of like staying from that classroom perspective. So I think it's a given that you should do that, and I think we both agree on that. We're not having any discussion on it. But how do we get more people involved? In this conversation? What's the way forward, and where do we need to go? What kind of actions do we need to take? Yeah. We're also talking about what unions need to be doing. What can we do ourselves? So do we need to leverage technology more? So what kind of promising professional issues are important? So what's the way forward?
Yeah, I think I can talk mostly about what I think EI and its affiliates think we need to do around this. I think we need to do a better job at flipping the narrative and telling our story, talking about the importance of schools and communities, and the importance of the teaching profession to democracy, to human rights, us as wisdom workers, in terms of making sense of a time of great anxiousness and insecurity. I think we need to do a better job doing that. I think the best way we do that is by listening to our members and listening to our fellow teachers, whether or not they're in the union or not. They're valuable and they need to be listened to. And the fact is that right now we're experimenting and looking and doing research into a platform that doesn't view teachers as a commodity or somebody to sell something to, a potential marketplace, but views them as a place where we can genuinely collaborate and share these ideas, share these stories, share what's working with our students, the successes with integrating refugee kids, with helping integrate people with disabilities, things that touch us when we go into the classroom and we close the door at the end of the day and we're about to go home and we're packing up our stuff and we go, I made a difference today because I know, he told, so-and-so told me that he wasn't sure he was going to make it, and I could tell, looked in his eyes, he's there, and those things that we tell ourselves, that intrinsic, that inherent value of what we do, that's our real power. And so instead of it being Google or Microsoft or any of these companies that are building these platforms that we are unwittingly turning over our privacy and our information and our also to then be sliced and diced and datafied and then sold back to us.
So we're actually we're being part of this system that we don't want to be part of anymore.
We're feeding into the system. Instead of doing that, I think what we should do is take the best learning around the open movement, the open science movement, the open education movement, the porosity going the other way, being in terms of connection, and say, well, we're doing all this stuff ourselves. Why should I be a content, provider for Google or for Facebook or for somebody else? I want to be a critical content provider and analyzer and interpreter for my colleagues in my profession, so I can get better at what I do, but also so I can actually, feel better and, so I can actually think that the thoughts that I'm having are part of a larger consciousness, a larger collective professional consciousness, and that there's some actions we can take. So we're experimenting with trying to build the first completely and totally open education platform for teachers unions and their members to be able to share all the good work they're doing and have these conversations and to be able to flip that narrative. You like to flip?
Yeah, of course it is.
and to try to tell that story and to try to say you couldn't put a price on what we do, so we're not going to.
Yeah. Yeah, and so stimulate collaboration. So the platform itself becomes the society that you want to, what you want society to be like as well. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Because think about it, if you're reading something that really has you on fire and you want to share that, and you know in your network that people really like, they follow Jelmer because they share some of the fire in his belly and his ideas, and if he's reading something, they'd really like to have a conversation about that. So we want to have spaces where that can happen across languages and cultures too. We want the Freirians in Brazil to be able to talk to, the Deweyians in the US to be able, but not just the Deweyians, the Jelmerians and the people that are developing new ideas and thinking.
So what kind of things, and then we'll also go to some of the questions because we're overrunning in time.
No, we can see that.
So what kind of things do you think teachers are interested in? So like what draws them in? And then we go to the question.
I think what I know from my time as a teacher, from my contacts with teachers, what the focus groups and the surveys and the research and reading tells me is if we're only going to pull in people when they see value in taking the limited amount of time they already have in a time when they're feeling very compressed and by being part of that, they build something that's greater than the sum of the parts, and that it directly reflects back to their practice. It directly reflects back to the policies that they're living in their classroom, in their schools, in their communities. It directly relates back to actions that they can take that are connected to those values.
Yeah.
I think the way you pull people in is by allowing yourself to be pulled into their conversations.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that's something also I think connected to one of the questions that I saw here. So understanding that there's no magic formula because it's also about union renewal and how we can organize ourselves maybe differently as well. So how do unions attract more younger members and leaders? So that's also a question that comes up.
That's an existential question. I think by doing the things that we're talking about, I don't want to go what you shouldn't do if you care about renewal, but you can also look at Howard's research on this.
Howard Stevenson's
research on what unions are doing. You got to create spaces. It's not like it was where the information gets passed on and I'll let you know what you need to know when you need to know it.
It's like a pyramid model.
Yeah, it's not like that anymore. It's people are concerned with what's happening in the world. They want to take action. In terms of their union, maybe they don't want to be today they don't want to be a school rep. Maybe today they don't want to be the president of their local, but they're willing to organize something. They're willing to be part of some sort of climate change action or do something on one of the sectors or something. We need to know what those things are and be able to help them connect up with others to do those things and help give them the resources and support to move those up. And if we can from the top open up and leverage some spaces so that policymakers and corporates and others can hear them, then we should do that.
Yeah.
But also vice versa. So I think we need to be relevant. I really think we need to be relevant about the issues of the day. We need to be relevant in terms of their practice and the things that they need in their classrooms, their professional development. We need to not be scared. We need to be brave. We need to go into forays into areas that haven't traditionally been our place.
Yeah.
We need to stand with the social justice people. We need to march. We need to hold hands with we need to step into the void and protect the vulnerable at a time of Trump and Brexit Erdogan and Duterte. It's
You can't stand by anymore. Yeah.
We are the only things. I was at a meeting at the UN, and a number of small NGOs and groups were saying, like, oh my gosh, basically only thing between these corporations and their designs on privatizing and selling everything is the organized education profession. The organized teachers unions and students unions.
I think it's similar. There's a couple of questions that are related, and this one was the last one. Should we fight against corporate use of big data to corrupt our education systems on the same playing fields, so that they try to use big data and economic arguments, or should we base our arguments in a more holistic human terms? So move away from economic arguments, move away from hard science, and have a more. I recognize that discourse that we have in the Netherlands at the moment as well. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of Dennis Shirley's work on the 5 imperatives, right? And this is the interpretive imperative in a way, right? So this is the move towards a more away from a quantitative and more qualitative analysis on it. I think in terms of getting the public to understand what's at stake, the bumper sticker economic, rate of return arguments aren't there. It's and I do believe that the emotional, holistic, those are important. But at the same time, if there is a killer fact that needs to be out there, if we know that 8 people control the same wealth as 50% of the world's population,
which is the case,
that is quantifiably true.
Yeah.
And that's something we can mobilize around. And we should also buttress that up with talking about the problems of inequality. And, but what I do is I try to understand the frame with which the person I'm talking to. I think conversation is really important. So I try to understand what informs or what the frame is of the person I'm dealing with. And I'm willing to make an argument to you. I will first try it from a rights approach, and I will probably end on it from a rights approach because that's my mooring. But I can actually use OECD data to show why teachers unions are absolutely essential. I can use OECD data because if you take, but it's just for that small moment, those policymakers, those wonks, if you take the US and Canada, right? 2 very different countries right next to each other have made very different choices. Or if I take Finland and Sweden, 2 countries made very different choices and got very different results, right? One in doubling down on the public expenditure and services, and the other outsourcing everything until the point where shareholders go, I don't know if it's in our interest to educate kids anymore. So you can use illustrative examples as long as you don't go too far down the rabbit hole of being in there.
Everything evidence-based.
Yeah,
more to evidence.
But that's the great thing about being connected to the teaching profession, because we're we're sociologists, we're economists, we do portraiture, we do ethnography. We should be able to roll up and to put out the argument of what we believe and why we believe it.
Yeah.
Using a variety of different disciplinary.
It's interesting because we have all the knowledge. I think it's already inherent in a teaching profession.
Yeah.
So how did we end up being in that box? So it's interesting. It's good to look back, but it's also good to look forward, I think. Let's do one more question. And I think it's related. How can we make people re-understand, so that's an assumption, that the real purpose of education in a democratic society is to teach the values of cooperation, fairness, and justice? And it reminds me of a union meeting I was last Friday. And so there was also the view that we have a really narrow role as educators. We have to teach knowledge and facts, but this is a different kind of statement. So what's your take? I know what your take is, but still.
Well, I think the person asked, and it's a good question, and it's a question that I think everyone should be asking themselves all the time in every moment. It's not a question that gets a quick and answer. I think what's happened in the sort of thing is we think of our school and our community in one way, and we think of the world in another way. We're sort of this bifurcated, where and research supports this, where we think of the world as a lot of people think of the world as a scary place with a lot of injustice and danger and violence. But my school is, okay. So if you rate your school and you rate the school down the street, they found that people will say that's more violent or that's less quality. But my school is of a good quality. And I think that what that reflects is the desire of people to live in a just and fair society. They know what it is and they know what that looks like. And at the same time, evidence suggests that through the only way to sort of break through a lot of the bias that some people hold against different groups or against different countries or different religions, is by having an interaction
and the connection
and that connection. So actually, it's until people engage and have the opportunity to get past the othering that happens and personalize and know someone, we're not going to get there. So I think to make them re-understand it is you have to help them reconceptualize what it is to be human at this moment in time, a human being with rights, with desires, with fears, and talking about the sort of universality of those. The universality of a young parent who's worried about their kid not being able to get to school without being attacked.
Whether you're in the United States or in Uganda or the Netherlands, I agree. So let's building on that. Let's do one more question and then we have to wrap it up. It's related to this, and I think it's a very important one. How do we get more involved in social justice issues while still retaining union members in rural conservative areas that disagree with that philosophy? And I think I know who poses that question. It could be Mike. So that's a very, very big question, also a universal question, I think, as well. It's not just related to the United States or Europe, it's also, I think, in Africa or in other continents as well. So what's your take?
I think in every community, there are injustices that are just underneath the surface. And it's people who live in those rural areas that understand them better. They understand where the opportunities aren't. They understand who has access to power. They understand who has access to capital, to whatever it is. I firmly believe that if you look at sort of the landless movement in Brazil, rural peoples, if you look at some of the civil rights movement, if you look at Chavez, if you look at Hugo, if you look at Cesar Chavez, there are things that people care about in rural communities that are of themselves fundamentally about justice. And it's fundamentally about community. And it is trying to find ways of talking to them about those issues and then connecting them. So if your issue is that in a rural area where there's a one-room schoolhouse, or there's not access to something, or that could be something you can organize around.
And in the United States, for example?
Well, I mean,
so like a rural-urban divide there?
Yeah, there is. I mean, the United States is at the time of Dr. King and the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers were there at the same time as the Southern, as the same time as Dr. King's movement. And Dennis Shirley tells this story about Dr. King was understood that when he was talking to rural sharecroppers and he was talking to people, whether that was on a Sunday afternoon after church, he assumed a certain demeanor, and he assumed certain way of talking to them about these issues. And eventually, by the end of it, you could get to the more universal human values, just because someone is born a certain way, blah, blah, blah. There is a way, I think, that you don't send in your, ultra pierced, and I got a lot of brothers and sisters that are ultra pierced and are fighting a really good fight, but I don't know if those are your spokespeople. I think your spokespeople have to be people that kind of come out of that community.
Yeah.
They're the ones that are going to validate, and they're the ones that are going to be able to break through. I think you have to be careful, because the separators like Trump that says you with your New York values and me with my Middle America values, or you with your, I don't know, Rotterdam values and me with my Friesland, whatever values, that's a false dichotomy. We all have the same rights, inherent rights from the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We all have the same constitutional rights given from our, and I think that's where you start. And so if it's a disenfranchisement about voting, a disenfranchisement about services, you have to have that conversation. I think too many people in our movement are very happy to stay in urban centers, drink our lattes, and complain about rural people and how they don't get it. But very few of us are willing to go and teach in those areas. Like, to me, the real social justice activists in the US after Trump were the ones that took teaching positions in hardcore Trump states.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're not long, but we're a little bit over time, and it's been long running. So for those of you who...
Sorry about that.
It's always nice to talk to you, and also always interesting. So for those of you who stayed until the end, thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think David so you learn a lot from David, and we're gonna do another one hopefully pretty soon. Thank you for staying on. We'll record this, and we're going to share it around, and you can watch it back if you want it, and share it with your colleagues. And I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.